cracked it. Hey.
Hey. Calling Chris Anderson. Where are you?
I'm on the floor of my hotel room in Cambridge, in beautiful Cambridge, England.
Fantastic.
And where are you calling in from?
I am. I have my computer on the ironing board
Cool.
in my fabulous hotel room in London,
Wow.
UK. So you vacated. I was here. We actually saw each other yesterday.
Briefly in passing.
Stayed at the same hotel and had a drink together before you and Anna went out for dinner. So that was nice. Hey, everybody, welcome to History Happy Hour. Thanks to Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours for sending us out on the road and for helping to bring you this show. And you should check out their rich offering of military history tours at StephenAmbroseTours.com. And whether you're watching live or on replay or listening on the HHH podcast.
Did that. Wow.
Yeah, we are so glad you're here today. We're going to be talking about France in World War II and Charles de Gaulle, and it should be fun. And Chris, I want to take a moment to thank our Patreon supporters, especially our top shelf supporters.
Absolutely.
And Lydia, who is one of the guests on your tour, and one of our faithful watchers, informed me this morning of 2 errors in here, which I have corrected. Okay. Look, guys, if there are mistakes in here, you got to tell me. So I hadn't noticed apparently for several months that I had Tom as TPM and listed Connie McKenzie twice. So
she was just saving that back, waiting for the moment to zing you.
Okay, yeah. So anyway, you can join us as a patron, a patron for any amount of money per month, top shelf patron for the grand price of at least $20 a month, and help us keep the history taps open. So please think about doing that if you want to. Chris, do we have viewers? Is there anybody out there?
We absolutely do. We have Lizzie, of course, from London, and Lydia S., who is ghosting us from Cambridge, UK. Craig Congdon from Oregon. Ron Griswold from Cornwall. Liz Mumford from Maryland. So yeah.
Excellent. Harold Bolts, Stephen Esty from Western Massachusetts. BJ from Nashville, all sorts of people here joining us today. And so where are you heading on the rest of your?
Here in Cambridge for a couple of days, and then we're going up to Lincolnshire to talk about Bomber Command. So a little bit B-17s, 8th Air Force, and then up north to talk about Bomber Command.
Oh, fantastic. Well, I'm heading up to Bletchley Park tomorrow, and then Suffolk House, and then on to Normandy. So
say hi to Normandy for me.
I will. So give me a cue and let's get this show on the road.
Bing.
The bar is open.
Yes.
Hey, what's on tap?
Yeah, I'm super duper excited about this week's show. We're going to be joined by Dr. Douglas Porch, and Dr. Porch is the professor of national security affairs at the Naval Postgraduate School. He's a graduate of Cambridge, where I'm sitting on the floor right now, and a postdoctorate research fellow of the École Normale Supérieure and the Mark Clark Professor of History at the Citadel. He's written a bunch of books, all of which are super. Amongst them are The March to the Marne, the French Army in 1871 to 1914, The French Foreign Legion, A Complete History of the Legendary Fighting Force, which is what his first book of his that I read and I absolutely loved. And he's now also just finished up 2 volumes on the history of France in World War II, the first volume being Defeat and Division, France at War, 1939 to 1942. And the most recent book, and the book that we're here to talk about this week, is Resistance and Liberation, France at War, 1942 to 1945. All of his books are wonderful, and really excited about this one.
Doug Porch, welcome to History Happy Hour.
It's just such a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, did you ever have to sit on the floor in Cambridge?
Well, only when I was bad in class.
Well, there you go. I've done something wrong.
And before Chris starts pelting you with questions, did you happen to bring a cocktail to this extravaganza?
Well, what I actually have is a Pinot Noir
very nice.
from Monterey County, California. It's called La Petite Grace. there is an error on the label because they left the accent circumflex off the A in glace.
All right.
So I spent a lot of time wine tasting and correcting the French on wine. I'm surprised I have any time to get work done, real work.
But that's important. It's important that you do that. Well, good. And you, Rick?
Oh yeah, I have.
Oh,
I have a very. It's almost like a anonymous label
I was gonna say it's
IPA
like no name beer.
that I bought at the Waitrose.
You're high rent this week, aren't you?
Yeah. How about you? I think it cost me £1.90
I have a nice claret
at the red wine. That's good. All right, your batter's up, man. You got to ask.
All right. Well, I mean, I think one of the places I know that we'd exchanged some emails that I wanted to start this conversation with is take people back, since we were both in London recently, to June 18th, 1940. There's a man about to make a radio broadcast, and it's an event that, I think people have said is one of the most important speeches in French history. Every Frenchman knows about June 18th and the appeal. Most Americans have no idea what you're talking about. So if you could tell us a little bit about Charles de Gaulle, the man who's making this appeal, what brings him to that point, and let's kind of start that story there.
Well, I mean, that's a very interesting story because France, of course, the front buckled at a place called Boulson, which was near Sedan in May. And this began a cascade of retreat by the French army, which bounced from Tours and then eventually ended in Bordeaux. And it was quite clear that to Churchill that the French were going to leave the war. So he sent a friend of his to Bordeaux to find somebody to fight on. Sir Edward Spears, who was the member for Carlisle, who had been the liaison officer with between the British and the French army in the First World War. And he found de Gaulle and brought him back. Now, de Gaulle was a temporary brigadier. When Churchill saw that, he said, "Why did you bring back this man? I wanted somebody really important. I wanted a politician, someone that someone had heard about, around whom we could organize a continuation of the war for France." And Spears told him nobody else would come. He was the only person who would come. Now, de Gaulle was relatively unknown. He was, you would say, a mid-level defense intellectual. He had written an important book in 1935 called Vers l'armée de métier, which is usually translated the army of the future into English, when in fact what it means is toward a professional army, which he called upon France to create a large tank army. And of course that didn't happen, at least in the way he envisioned it. He wanted a very high-tech combination of tanks and airplanes. The French had a lot of tanks, but they scattered them out. They saw tanks as an infantry support weapon rather than something you could mass and punch through, as the Germans unsportingly did in 1940. So he makes this speech on the 18th of June, 1940, which was the day after Pétain had made a speech saying that he was going to ask for an armistice. So this is regarded as the beginning of the resistance. So what de Gaulle basically says is France has lost a battle. France has not lost a war. If we unpack what he's saying, first thing he gives is an explanation for the defeat. He says that the German victory was a contingent event. Germany had more tanks, they had more planes, they had better tactics. So as we get into it, when historians and others debate why France fell so rapidly in 1940, contingency is one of the explanations. So de Gaulle is the father of contingency, but he didn't really believe in contingency. He believed that France fell because of democracy. Democracy had lost the war in France because it had created a chaotic condition within France that meant that the French could not create a war culture. They could not sustain the war, that French soldiers were quickly demoralized and began surrendering in large numbers. So if you want, we can talk about those contingent versus democracy arguments, which were to come in. The second thing he reminded people is that it was an alliance war, that France had lost the battle, but there was still Britain with the empire and the enormous industrial resources of the United States that were available. And remember, the German-Russian Pact had been signed in August 1939, so the Soviets were not in it yet. They were effectively allies of Nazi Germany at the time. But he basically made this argument that there's no way Germany had the manpower and the resources to win this war. Now, those like Pétain, who were at Vichy, were saying, well, the war's over, right? Germany's won it. They're going to dominate Europe. So we at Vichy, we might as well make an arrangement with Germany. And the best way for France to survive is through collaboration with Germany and become part of the sort of German-controlled European empire. So that's the second way, and in which he was very prescient, where Frenchmen were so demoralized, but he said, this war is not over, it's going to go on. And France needs to be on the winning side. And to be on the winning side, the flame of resistance must not be extinguished. Those are his words. So this becomes controversial because he's basically declaring that he is the resistance. Number one, he says the French resistance. So historians looking at this say, well, we don't talk about the French resistance anymore. We talk about resistance in France. So from a historical perspective, resistance in France is seen as part of a larger movement throughout not only Europe, but the world against fascist aggression. So this is one of the things that one is going to focus on during the liberation. I was looking at one of your earlier episodes with the liberation of Paris, and how it was sort of surprising that you had these Spanish Republicans in the Second Armored Division, the Deuxième DB. But in fact, this is one of the things that shocked de Gaulle, is that in the internal French resistance, there were loads of foreigners, because there were all sorts of people, Spanish Republicans, deserters from the German army, Osttruppen, refugees, Polish refugees, who were part of the French resistance. So the French resistance wasn't, in fact, all French. So, but he says resistance is my legitimacy. When he meets at the ANFA or Casablanca conference with Churchill and Roosevelt in January 1943, and we can talk about later Roosevelt and de Gaulle. They didn't really like each other very much. Roosevelt didn't understand de Gaulle, but Roosevelt says to de Gaulle, what is your legitimacy? And de Gaulle says, I'm Clemenceau, I'm Jeanne d'Arc, I'm Joan of Arc. And Roosevelt is totally taken back, and he and Churchill have a good laugh about that. And if this guy thinks he's Joan of Arc, but what they didn't understand is that for de Gaulle, taking up arms in defense of France, that's his legitimacy. I don't need to be elected by anybody. Like Joan of Arc, I take up arms in defense of France. That is my legitimacy.
So you called de Gaulle the black cat of the Western Alliance, and he has sort of an ally in Churchill. Eventually, Churchill kind of becomes de Gaulle's ally, and he has sort of an enemy, if that's not too strong a word, in FDR. What is dividing de Gaulle and FDR? Is it personality? Is it politics? Is it their view of the war? What's kind of the what's the rub there?
If you will allow me to read just the first paragraph of de Gaulle's memoirs, which are really quite famous. Now, this is my translation, so excuse it, sort of fractured. The first paragraph of his 3-volume memoirs, he writes, "All my life, I've nurtured a certain idea of France. The emotional side of me naturally imagines France like the princess in the fairy tales or the Madonna in the frescoes, as dedicated to an imminent and exceptional destiny. My instinct tells me that Providence created her for brilliant success or exemplary misfortunes. If mediocrity characterizes her acts and gestures, I feel that it's an absurd anomaly, attributable to the shortcomings of the French, not to the genius of the motherland. But also logic tells me that France is only herself when in the first rank, that only vast enterprises are able to compensate for the ferment and divisions inherent in her people. That our country, in the midst of mortal danger, must aim high and stay focused. In short, France is not France without greatness." Now, Roosevelt hears this sort of sentiment being expressed. And he says, "You're not a great power anymore. You lost. So why should you sit at the table with nations like eventually the Soviet Union, like Great Britain, like the United States, when in fact you completely rolled over in the war?" So that's one of the differences between the men, that France doesn't really deserve to be at the top table. And Stalin feels the same way. I mean, when at the end of the war, Churchill insists that France have an occupation zone in Germany, Stalin says that's an insult to the Soviet people. You know, the French haven't fought, so why do they deserve that? So there's partly this sort of imbalance, but it's also about values. As far as de Gaulle is concerned, France deserves a place at the table because France is France. It's the essential nation. And he wants to keep his empire because that's part of France's power and France's glory. Roosevelt doesn't care about that. He wants to reestablish the world on a completely new basis, with a new economic foundation, a new security foundation. For Roosevelt, the war is between democracy and fascism. For de Gaulle, the war is not only to reestablish French power, but it's a revival of this Franco-German rivalry that has been going on for almost 100 years. So you can call it the 30 Years' War between France and Germany, or the 100 Years' War between France and Germany. That's the way de Gaulle sees it. He's not actually fighting to restore democracy. And this is going to be one of the conflicts that he's going to have with the internal resistance, because a lot of the internal resistance is made up of fairly left-wing Republicans. And they see de Gaulle as a sort of autocrat, and they're not sure what his political aims are. And initially in the war, they say, well, what do you stand for? Are you going to restore democracy? And he says, don't ask me to restore something that lost the war for us. Eventually, he sort of comes around, in part because he understands that he is in alliance with democratic nations, and that he really sort of has to get with the program. That's number one. Number two is that the internal resistance is pushing him, and he needs the internal resistance for his legitimacy. The internal resistance is pushing him to acknowledge that he is going to restore democracy in France. So he has to sort of go with the flow. And it takes him a while to do that because he's a very conservative man. And many people think he should be at Vichy. I mean, he's an ardent Catholic. He is a man of authoritarian temperament. He is a military officer. He has a reputation within the French army as being, I say, something of a maverick. He is a thorn in the side of his commanding officers. One of the men that he will have conflict with is Henri Giraud. Henri Giraud was his commanding officer in the 1938 maneuvers. And at the end of those maneuvers, de Gaulle goes up to him and says, "Mon général, you don't know how to use tanks." So it didn't exactly endear him to his commanding officers. So that's going to keep a lot of people from joining him initially when he puts out his call, this 18th June call, in which he says all soldiers in Great Britain and technicians, I'm setting up the Free French, this Free French movement, and join with me. And a lot of people say, oh, de Gaulle, I don't know. You know, he's got a bad reputation in the army, and maybe we better wait and see how that turns out.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, you know, when you look at the appeal, I'd be curious to know kind of how it went over. I mean, is the fame of it or the importance of it something that's applied later after we know how the story turns out? I mean, as you said, he's something of an unknown, and he's making this radio broadcast. Is anybody listening?
No. I mean, almost nobody heard it. This is going to be a source of conflict. And it no longer exists, by the way, because some archivist in the BBC said, oh, well, here we got this recording of some old French general. Well, it just lost this. So there you go. But so what happens is that the resistance fragments. So what de Gaulle sets up is the external resistance, right? He eventually collects what amounts to, I think the British ration strength in 1942 sort of assesses it at 60,000 men, more or less. A few rallied to him in London, mainly from the Narvik expedition, which was being brought back. A few were evacuated from Dunkirk, but I think he gets only about 7,000 men then. Some escaped through Spain, like Leclerc, Philippe d'Hautecloque, who takes on the name of the resistance name of Leclerc. But eventually not many. He's going to have to assemble an army in the colonies. So the external resistance is mavericks, people who join him because they leave everything behind. And you have to be able to leave everything behind. And some people like Biot, who he talks to in London, who he knows because they had been at Saint-Cyr, which is the French military academy together, come join me. And Biot says, well, you know, I've got to be on the Narvik expedition. I've got to see my troops home. I've got a family. My wife's there.
I got to cut the grass. I got to.
No, what you have to say with de Gaulle is, I got a change of underwear and a clean shirt, and I'm coming with you, right? And that's what we're going to do the next 5 years. We won't see France, but I am committed to you. So that's the external resistance. And then they gradually collect these black and brown people from various colonies. So it's 60,000 people. I mean, if you see those who escape from Bir Hakeim, they're not French. I mean, they're not Français de la souche they're not white French from the hexagon. Most of them are colonial subjects that have been picked up outside. So that's who he's fighting with. So that's the first thing. The second thing is external resistance has a strange resonance within the context of French history, because it reminded people of a man called the Duc de Condé. And during the French Revolution, the Duc de Condé assembled a group of royalist dissenters, and they fought in the Austrian army and they fought in the Russian army, and they were subsidized by Great Britain. So for people inside France, and Vichy used this. They said, this is just the Duc de Condé. I mean, these are these dissenters who didn't like the French Revolution. So that's what de Gaulle is. So in the context of French history, being in the external resistance wasn't seen as a real resistance. They didn't share the hardships. They didn't share the Gestapo raids, that the French had to put up with. And because nobody had ever heard, or very few people had heard, this call to resistance, the resistance is sort of generated spontaneously within France. And he meets these internal resistors who gradually come via Lysander airplane to London to sort of meet him. And they say, why are you legitimate? Just like Roosevelt had said, we started resistance spontaneously. Right? It was our little group in the Musée de l'Homme. And it's usually just sort of groups of people who know each other at work or who are friends. And they think, what can we do here? I mean, how do we resist this? And usually it starts out as information sheets. And it starts out as propaganda. And then there are escape and evasion networks. And then there are false papers. And then eventually intelligence gathering. And then eventually sabotage. So it sort of grows into what one historian calls résistance organisée. That is the organized resistance. And it's very small. I mean, it's what? You hear various estimates, but it's what? 1.05 to 1% of the French population. I mean, it's got to be small. I mean, you can't say, hey, I'm in the resistance. Let's have a big party. I mean, the Vichy is going to break that up. But they basically say, why do you speak for the resistance? We didn't hear that broadcast. Why do you speak for us? Mm-hmm. And that, what changes that is Roosevelt. Roosevelt says, who are you? What's your legitimacy? De Gaulle says, I'm legitimate because I lead the resistance. The resistors are saying, you don't lead the resistance. We generated spontaneously within France. So de Gaulle sends this man called Jean Moulin, who had been a prefect in the Third Republic, who the Germans had tortured because he refused to sign an affidavit blaming French black troops, Senegalese troops, for an atrocity that the Germans had carried out in 1940. So they tortured him, and he eventually escapes to London, and de Gaulle sends him back with the mission. He said, the resistance, you have to unify the leadership in the resistance so that they recognize me, Charles de Gaulle, as leader of resistance in France, or the French resistance. That way, then I can tell Roosevelt, that's my legitimacy. So that's how that works out.
So there's so many directions that we can go in here, and it's a big book that goes a lot of ways, and it's a very complex situation for anybody who's French, because just to look at the map, you've got the country is divided into different zones: the occupied zone, which is Vichy France, the zone libre, the occupied zone, which is occupied, the zone libre, which is Vichy France. And then you've got the French who are inside France, and then you've got de Gaulle, you've got people in North Africa. One of the people who I was really struck by reading your book, who illustrates the complexity of issues facing the French in 1940, is General Alphonse Juin. In 1942, he is a chum of Rommel. He's making plans to defend North Africa against the Allies. A year later, he's one of the Allies. He's leading French troops on the side of the Allies in a victory at Monte Cassino, which he is very critical to. Can you talk a little bit about kind of what he represents, his change of heart, and how he was viewed by his contemporaries?
Yes. Well, I mean, it's sort of exemplary. He was captured in 1940, fighting on the front, and he was released by the Germans because the French argued that they needed troops who were experienced in North Africa. And Juin, by the way, was what the French call a pied noir. I mean, it literally means Blackfoot, but it is an Algerian of European extraction. In other words, he was a settler in North Africa. So he had an affinity for North Africa. The colonies were seen as force multipliers. France and Germany were more or less equal in terms of population in 1871 when Germany was unified, but the French population stagnated, so that by the time you get to World War II, Germany has almost twice the population as France. So the colonies are seen as force multipliers for France, both demographically, in other words, they have some manpower pool, and obviously geographically. So they give a strategic depth to France. So Juin is very much in this mindset that the colonies are essential for the survival of France. Now, initially in 1940, the colonies rally to the Vichy government, in part because the settler population and the colonial administration fear that civil war between white Frenchmen will simply loosen their grip on the colonies, that the indigenous populations will see the French are not divided, so they are not united. So they will begin to agitate for independence. So the whole thing from their point of view is to keep the solidarity of the colonies intact. Now, it surprises Juin because he is commander of the ground forces in North Africa. It surprises when the Allies suddenly land in November 1942. Now, think about it. The United States comes into the war in December 1941, right? So we are 11 months after the United States came into the war, and all of a sudden, the Anglo-Americans dump 100,000 troops in North Africa in November, when anybody who knows North Africa says it's insane to try an amphibious operation in November because the surf, especially on the Moroccan coast, because the surf is really high. So they're not coming, if the Allies come, they're not coming before late spring or early summer 1943. So all of a sudden, you have all these Allied troops turning up. What are we going to do? We've got no plans for this. Juin was thinking, well, who's going to invade? Is it going to be the Germans or is it going to be the Allies? And he was at loggerheads with Darlan, Admiral Darlan, Jean Darlan, who is the Minister of War with Vichy. And Darlan, being a sailor, is much more afraid of the British fleet appearing in Tunisia and Bizerti or in particular. And so they can't agree on where the invasion is going to come when it comes, if it comes. Is it going to be the Germans dropping back from the Western Desert? Is it going to be the Germans coming through Spain and invading Morocco? So they're trying to war game a German invasion. At the same time, they're thinking, well, how will the Americans come if the Anglo-Americans come? And keep in mind, I mean, amphibious operations, I mean, this is the first one that works. I mean, 1940, you can't do an amphibious operation. And 1942, they tried Dakar. There had been the fiasco at Dieppe. There had been an aborted amphibious operation to take back Tripoli in Libya, in what is now Libya, and none of these had worked. So, I mean, this is an unproven operational concept, and all of a sudden it works. And this is going to be a really important stage in getting to Normandy. because you have to develop the boats, you've got to develop the techniques, you've got to be able to have the intelligence that you're going to Bletchley. You have to have the intelligence to know if you're sending a fleet from Virginia and another fleet down from Glasgow, and they're supposed to rendezvous, how are you going to evade the U-boats? I mean, the U-boats are going to set up ambushes for this fleet, and your fleet would never get there. So you've got to know where the U-boats are, so you can direct the fleet around that. So it's going to be an extremely complex operation. So the bottom line is Juin is sort of surprised. Now, the context which I tried to explain is that Roosevelt recognized Vichy, the Vichy government. Roosevelt refuses to recognize de Gaulle. The idea is that we, the Americans, can entice the Vichy French to come back into the war. Now, that's a total illusion, but that's what they're trying to do. Now, keep in mind that Roosevelt is in no hurry to win this war. He wants to take his time because he's looking at the après-guerre, right? What happens after the war? And he's a Wilsonian. And he subscribes to this Wilsonian view that the world has to be reorganized on a new basis. And that's going to take time, that not only must you win the battles, but you have to prepare for the peace by putting in democratic governments as you go forward. So let's start with the Mediterranean. I wrote a book on the Mediterranean, and I wrote it because the going idea at the time was the Mediterranean campaign had been a total waste of time. That people like Wiedemeyer and others were saying, why did he do this? We got bogged down into a very political theater, and it delayed Overlord. Now, I argued in the book that you can't go from Dunkirk to Overlord without going through the Mediterranean, and from an operational and tactical point of view. But people like Andrew Buchanan and others have added on to that argument, saying that you can't go from fascism to democracy without going through the Mediterranean, that you have to take your time and reestablish in Italy and elsewhere democratic governments. And the problem that Roosevelt had is the war ended too quickly. Sorry, that Wilson had. The war ended too quickly. The Americans weren't influential enough. He wanted to make sure that the full gamut of American power was online when Germany surrendered in 1940, eventually in 1945. What happened in 1918 was that the Germans very unsportingly left the war before the Americans were at full strength. So therefore, we had no clout. Wilson had no clout at Versailles. And Clemenceau could turn around and say, well, where were you guys? I mean, you turn up in 1917, and it's all very nice, and we certainly appreciate it. But we fought this war, and so we're going to decide how it's sorted out. Roosevelt says, I want to be the big dog at the party when we get to Yalta and Potsdam, and so that's why he's in no hurry to win this war. So he's going to do it in stages, and he sees North Africa as one of the stages to accomplish his goals. He still thinks that he can bring the Vichy French over, and in charge of Africa, the commander-in-chief is a man named Maxime Weygand, who had been Foch's chief of staff in World War I. He went on to be the chief of staff in the early 1930s of the French army. He's recalled during the defeat, and he's made commander-in-chief in North Africa. He is a notorious anti-German, or celebrated anti-German, depending on your point of view. And that seems like a new target, that the Americans can convince Weygand to come over, to shift North Africa without an invasion. And that there's the whole saga of Robert Murphy, who Roosevelt sends to North Africa to convince Weygand to basically invite the Americans, the Anglo-Americans in. Well, the Germans figure that out, and they put pressure on Vichy to remove Weygand, and which they do, and Weygand eventually ends up in Germany under arrest. But what Vichy does is saying, we cannot have somebody like Weygand in charge, because that's too vulnerable. The Americans might get to him and convince him to switch sides. So we're going to shatter the chain of command between the Army and the Navy, between the high commissioners and Vichy. So when the Americans when they land, nobody knows who's in charge. Everybody's phoning up. If you're in the Navy, you phone up the Navy command. If you're a high commissioner, you phone up Vichy. So who's going to order this resistance? So it's by the French. So it's this total confusion. And Juin is head of the French military. He doesn't expect this invasion. Especially not so soon. He's got really no plan to counter it. He's getting contradictory orders from everyone. He's only got 15,000 men in French troops in Tunisia, which is what the Germans and Italians do, because it's so close to Italy. So that's going to be their way in to North Africa. So all of a sudden they begin invading Tunisia. And what does Juin do? He orders a withdrawal of his troops back into Algeria. So I talk a little bit about this. Since my book was published, there is a French historian named Guillaume Douglas who has published a new biography of Juin. And Juin was afterwards, there was a commission to look into his withdrawal, because the Germans were coming over as paratroopers and as landing in yuncas on the airfields in Tunis. And a handful of French troops got to clean that up. And then the Italians arrive in ships at Bizerte Harbor, and they're just allowed to disembark. Whereas anybody could have stopped them from disembarking, because the British are coming in from Bougie. All he's got to do is hold them off for a few days, and we would not have had a Tunisian campaign. Now, we can argue whether that was a good thing or a bad thing, but at the time, obviously, Juin was under suspicion of having allowed the Germans to come in because of his pro-German sentiments. The Germans had let him go, had let him out of POW camp. That looked suspicious. He had met with Goering at one point. He was known to be a great admirer of Rommel, just from an operational and tactical point of view. It was suggested that one of the dreams might be, if Rommel had been pushed back by the British Eighth Army into Tunisia, that he would have joined with Rommel and gone forward. Well, I mean, that's just speculation, but in some of the rumors. But what happens with him is that at the Anfa conference, so there's this commission of inquiry that's going on in North Africa, and a lot of French soldiers are being court-martialed for collaboration with the Axis. The conditions at the Anfa/Casablanca conference of Roosevelt is that we will rehabilitate 8 infantry divisions and 3 armored divisions in the French army. You must do what we tell you to do. And we're telling you to go to Italy to fight. So the French Expeditionary Corps, starting out with 2 divisions, eventually grows to 4 divisions, is sent to be part of Mark Clark's Fifth Army in Italy. Juin is in command. So he's a person who is being investigated for his conduct in Tunisia in November 42. He's suspect of having pro-German sentiments, and he's going to have to redeem himself in North Africa. Now, I would argue, and I think other people would as well, that he is really the only really good French general in the French army by 1942. There might be some others who might have developed had the French had the leisure the Americans had, and the British had to, lose a few battles and find better commanders and evolve. But the French didn't. So he's basically the person who saves the situation at Monte Cassino. I mean, Mark Clark just keeps doing these frontal assaults, and Juin says, "Look, we can't keep doing this. We're going to do infiltration tactics." So he infiltrates just south of on the Gagliano River, west of Monte Cassino, and he pierces the German lines in Monte Cassino, and basically saves Mark Clark's career because Mark Clark was probably on the chopping block, and Rome is liberated because really of the French. I say the French of Juin and the French Expeditionary Corps. Now he's the obvious choice to lead the Dragoon Anvil invasion, which is the invasion of southern France, which was meant to coincide with the Normandy invasion of the 6th of that you can see there on the 6th of June. It doesn't happen because the Allies are stuck at Anzio, and they need all of the landing craft to supply the Anzio beachhead. Rome is only liberated on the 4th of June, 1944, and of course that's just 2 days before the Overlord invasion that you two know so well. So who's going to lead the French troops in Anvil Dragoon? Well, it turns out to be de Lattre de Tassigny, because Juin is unacceptable to the internal resistance. So de Gaulle has to basically push aside his Saint-Cyr classmate and a man whom he knows is the better general in favor of de Lattre de Tassigny for those reasons. And that's not the end of the de Gaulle-Juin saga, because Juin, after the war, he's appointed the High Commissioner in Morocco, and he falls out with de Gaulle over Algerian independence in 1958. So he is actually put under house arrest by de Gaulle almost 2 decades later.
Well, so Doug, I need your help, and because I'm sure you can answer this much better than I can. I'm sure Rick is probably experiencing something similar to this, but when we lead tours, I think it's fairly typical for when we talk about France, our guests say, well, we did this for them, we liberated them, we saved them, they're ungrateful. Why is de Gaulle this way? And maybe you could help me answer that for my guests and say, what does France bring to the alliance? What does France participate, and how should we look at de Gaulle?
Okay. Well, the French, let me say how they would argue it. I mean, they would say, yes, we are grateful. Don't get us wrong. We know that America, the United States, and Great Britain liberated us. They concede that. But they would put some caveats. Like, number one, where were you guys in 1940 when we really needed you? And you hung us out to dry. The United States recognized Vichy and continued to recognize Vichy and continued to negotiate with Vichy, and then put Admiral Darlan in North Africa in November 1942. And when he was assassinated, you pushed this hack, Henri Giraud, on us. So in the end, who were you, Roosevelt, to try to dictate our political future? So they would definitely say that. Some might argue, or might have argued in the past, that the Allies, the Anglo-Americans, did not do enough to help the resistance, and I think that's been denigrated now by French historians who point out that especially the Maquis, which is these young men who are called up for forced labor in Germany, basically, and they take to the hills. So you've got this army of young men in the hills, mainly in the Alps, but also in the Massif Central, and they want to fight. So how do you operationalize this? And this was a real problem. And if you're going to look at Bomber Command toward the end of the war, there was a lot of pressure on them to drop supplies to the Maquis, Sten guns and equipment and uniforms and all sorts of other things. So, you didn't do enough to support the French resistance. Again, I don't buy that argument, but that was an argument that would have been made, I think, up until fairly recently. A third argument would be, yes, you liberated us, but it was extremely destructive. It was far more destructive than it need be. 60,000 French people died of air bombardment, mainly by the American Air Force. So because they were trying to bomb French industry, it wasn't precision bombing. It was basically area bombing, and a lot of towns like Le Creusot, or when they're invading, they're bombing factories outside of Paris. So a lot of French people get killed by Americans, not by the Germans. I mean, Germans killed plenty, don't get me wrong. But so and then you look at the Normandy invasion. Now, I had the great good fortune to marry a French woman who's been my wife for almost 50 years now. She is from a place that you will know well called Saint-Lô. So I heard a lot of stories about liberation in Saint-Lô, and that is bombing the town, putting the grandma in the wheelbarrow and wheeling her out into the bocage, and basically having a liberation that was more destructive than perhaps it need have been. When you go to Saint-Lô, if you go to the Saint-Lô cemetery, you will see a huge section which we'll call victimes civiles. And these were people who were killed by the Americans. I mean, inadvertently, of course. They weren't targeted. But in many of those small towns, you will see these sections of cemeteries that are victimes civiles. And so they asked the question, should it have been as destructive as it was? And you have this same thing in Alsace. And then, there are stories. If these are all died out now. I mean, but when I used to go in the 70s to see my wife, and they were always very nice to me and always very grateful. But these little stories would come out of not really good experiences. And I point out in my book, I mean, there were shots fired at American soldiers toward the end of the occupation, by December, because there was so much ill will toward the Americans. There were a number of rapes as well, which was resented. So again, I mean, these stories have sort of died out. I mean, they haven't been nurtured in any sort of institutional way. But for that generation that was liberated, I can remember my wife telling me the stories that she, as a young girl, she was utterly confused because she would hear people saying all these bad things about the Americans, and she said, "But I thought the Germans were the enemy." So these were anecdotal things. And then it was just the sort of arrogance. I mean, the humiliation. I mean, come on. I mean, you're a proud country if you're French, from France. I mean, you've made these huge cultural contributions to the world, the rights of man and the citizens. And here these Americans are coming in, and they're taking over the same buildings that the Germans had occupied, right? And American flags are everywhere. And there's the PX. And of course, all the girls want to go out. All the girls who were going out with the Germans are now want to go out with the GIs because they've got bucks. So, I mean, it's sort of bruised masculinity as well. I don't think it endures anymore. De Gaulle would never go to a D-Day ceremony. So he said you didn't invite him to invade. He's handed a script by Eisenhower to read out on the 5th of June, 1944. And he says, who are you, an American, to give me a script to read to my country? I mean, it's just this humiliation that, and they feel it deeply. And I mean, France sees itself as a great power, and it's not Poland, right? It's not Czechoslovakia. It's not one of these. It's not Belgium. It's not one of these places you can roll over and just discard. And what de Gaulle does, and I argue, I mean, he is the best politician in World War II. He does more with less than anybody else. I mean, he's not at Yalta, but he makes sure that the French are at Potsdam, right? He gets an occupation zone in Germany. He gets a seat on the UN Security Council. He keeps his empire. He gets Indochina back, which Roosevelt didn't want to give to him. Now, a lot of that with the connivance of the British, because the British are afraid, Churchill is afraid that the Americans are going to sort of bugger off like they did in 1919. So the British don't want to be left all by themselves. So even though Churchill and de Gaulle are at loggerheads over all sorts of issues toward the end of the war, especially the Levant, that the British, in the end, they want the French there because they're afraid the Americans are going to leave. And it's just going to be the British alone against Stalin and the Soviet Union. So it's really the British who managed to keep the French there. But de Gaulle had always, he had pleaded, not de Gaulle, Eisenhower had pleaded with Roosevelt to recognize de Gaulle. But the French government is not recognized until October 1944. So one of the things that de Gaulle is going to have to do is worry about, what is Roosevelt going to do? Is he going to cut another Darlan deal with Pierre Laval? Well, Hitler took care of that because he evacuated the whole Vichy government when the invasion came. But de Gaulle needs to reestablish the French state, and he wants it to be legitimate. He sees himself, and everybody else sees him as a legitimate ruler of France. But Roosevelt doesn't want to recognize this. So, I mean, the French take that as an insult, and you really can't blame them. So, that's more of their perspective, but they are grateful. And to say that they aren't, I think would be going too far. There was certainly a lot of hurt pride after the liberation, immediately after the liberation, and it endured. For instance, de Gaulle was so upset not only that he was not consulted about invading, about D-Day. There's only one French division, and that's the 12e DB, that's allowed to land at Utah Beach. And that was, toward the end. And that was just to be part of the percée d'Avranches, the breakout at Avranches, because he was there specifically to liberate Paris. De Gaulle wanted a French division.
So Doug, I have to interrupt you because I think we've kind of run out of time, but lots of stuff in this book, and amazing talking to you about it. The book is called Resistance and Liberation, France at War, 1942 to 1945, and it is part, as Chris mentioned, of a 2-volume set. What's the first volume called? I bet one of you knows.
It's right behind you.
Defeat and Division.
Death and Division.
Read them both. They're wonderful.
I got an award from the Society of Military History for the best book in military history for 2022. So
fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining us today on History Happy Hour.
Well, I'm happy to do it, and thank you for inviting me.
It was
great.
Our great pleasure. Thank you. And Chris, next week
Yes.
we will be back, and Chris and I want everybody else to know too. I'm really not just telling Chris. I'm telling you all. But we'll be back, and we'll talk to an HHH alum, Eric J. Dolan, who's got a new book called "Left for Dead: Shipwreck, Treachery, and Survival at the Edge." Oh, wrong cover. Try take two. Left for Dead: Shipwreck, Treachery, and Survival at the Edge of the World. And it's a story of survival. It's an adventure story and all of that. And we're going to dive into that with next week. And that should be lots of fun.
Rick's has promised me to sing a sea shanty to go.
Hey.
No, that's Animal House. No.
That was it. No, yeah. I do not recall making that promise.
It did, trust me, the other night.
Okay. All right. Well, I mean, I don't know, but okay. Anyway, everybody, thanks for joining us. Please subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Facebook, shout at us on Twitter, listen to our podcast, back us on Patreon, and browse historyhappyhour.com.
Wow. Thanks, everybody. Be safe.